As I've mentioned before, we'll spend some of our sessions focused very closely on the Lindenmeier site, the artifacts from it specifically, but we're also taking an opportunity during these few days to look at the larger picture of Folsom-era Paleo-Indians in Colorado. And so this next session is going to do just that for us. We have Dr. Nicole Wagaspak from the University of Wyoming speaking on the Barger Gulch site here in Colorado, again, a Folsom-era Paleo-Indian site. And as alluded to by Dr. LaBelle yesterday, there's some really exciting discoveries at this site that give us greater insight as to the living arrangements of these Folsom Paleo-Indians. So Dr. Wagaspak.
So as mentioned, I'm not going to be talking about the Lindenmeier site, sorry, but it's another very exciting Folsom Age site in Colorado. So I'll be talking about Barger Gulch, and for those of you who have heard some of the previous presentations here, Dr. LaBelle's talk yesterday and also Doc Frizen's discussion this morning, it'll touch upon some of these larger issues about Folsom Lifeways. So to start out, the Barger Gulch site is one of these sites in Middle Park, Colorado. And as Dr. Frizen mentioned, there's a real density of Folsom and early Paleo-Indian age sites in this region. You can see Middle Park there. Barger Gulch, what I'll be talking about specifically, we refer to as Locality B. And it's just outside of the town of Kremling, for any of you who have maybe been there or been out in the region. Here we're seeing an overview of the site itself. Notice that white tent is located just on top of the excavation area. We also heard yesterday some discussion of some of these residential Folsom sites, perhaps affording their occupants great views of their landscape. I think you can certainly see from this picture, we're probably looking at a very similar situation here in Middle Park at Locality B. As mentioned on this slide, there are actually 11 known Paleo-Indian localities within this immediate vicinity, so there's certainly tons of work to be done. I'll only be talking about our excavations at Locality B itself. Much like Lindenmeier, although somewhat differently, and I'll try to point out the differences between the Barger Gulch assemblage and the Lindenmeier lithic assemblage, but first off, I can say it's an enormous Folsom assemblage with a great diversity of different types of lithic artifacts. Over about 9 field seasons, we could actually increase that to about 11 total field seasons. We've excavated over 164 square meters. That's nowhere near the amount of dirt removed at Lindenmeier, but in more recent excavations, things tend to go a little more slowly. It took us quite a bit of time to open up those excavation areas you see labeled there. The main block, the east block, the south block, all of those little dots you see on those maps are actually mapped artifacts. We have over 75,000 artifacts recovered from this excavation area, and it includes a huge diverse array of Folsom lithic technology. The vast majority of the assemblage consists of flakes, pretty much debitage. Some of them have been utilized, some of them have not been. Again, Jason LaBelle mentioned one of the unique features of the Lindenmeier site is the fact that it's not located directly on top of a lithic raw material source. There are locally available raw materials, as Cody just talked about, but it's not associated with a large quarry area. Barger Gulch, while it's not located directly on top of a quarry, within, say, a 10-minute walk, you can access some incredible raw material known as Kremling chert or troublesome formation chert. So in this case, we're seeing an assemblage that's really dominated by this one locally available raw material. They were clearly producing a lot of different tools at the site to end up with over 75,000 pieces of debitage. Within that, we have over 500 flake tools. I'll show you some pictures in a minute. We also see a lot of cores. This is somewhat unusual in that when we look at Folsom sites that are located distantly from major raw material sources, we rarely have a glimpse of what their cores look like, how they were actually initially manipulating those tool sources. 84 bifaces, 27 Folsom preforms, 28 Folsom points, and 173 channel flakes. From our excavation area, all of the diagnostics we've recovered are Folsom. Out on the surface and out in this landscape, we do see some later materials, but in this excavation area that I'll be talking about, it appears to be Folsom and Folsom only. Looking at some pretty pictures, everyone likes to see Folsom points. Many items in this assemblage, you could probably slip right into the Lindenmeier assemblage and not even notice a difference. Here's a collection of Folsom points. Notice we have everything from small broken nubbins. We also have some points that were broken during manufacture. So we're seeing the whole sequence of Folsom projectile point use lives. Here's some more of those preforms. We could be impressed with pictures. Bifaces. Notice that all of this sort of milky white chert you see is this locally available Kremling or troublesome chert. Just about any artifact you see that's a different color is representing exotic tools that were likely brought into the site. Here's a Folsom preform. Notice it's made on exotic raw material. And one of the things I'll be talking about in this talk is some lithic refitting that we've done with this assemblage. So for any of you that are flint knappers or have seen anyone engage in flint knapping, you know that all those little pieces of stone can actually be fit right back together, and we can see the sequence of flake removals. So here's a series of artifacts. They were all found within about 4 meters of each other that we recovered during excavation that we could then piece back together into one of these artifact refit sequences. Collection of scrapers, gravers. This is what I was mentioning, some of those artifacts we don't often see at sites that are located distant from lithic raw material sources. These are large size cores made of this Kremling chert. As I mentioned, you can walk about 10 minutes from the site location itself to access some huge outcrops of this troublesome formation chert. It's clear that these Folsom individuals were traveling out there, selecting some high quality pieces, doing some initial cortex removal, and bringing them back to the residential site to sort of finish up their manufacturing activities. I now want to shift a little bit. You've seen lots of pictures of pretty Folsom artifacts. You're probably all familiar with a diverse array of tool morphologies we tend to find in these Folsom age sites. What me and some colleagues at the University of Wyoming really wanted to do at the Barger Gulch site was to get some glimpse of what was Folsom residential site life like. So if we could pop into a Folsom site like Lindenmeier, that we know isn't a bison kill site, we know it's a place where people lived and interacted, built houses, made and utilized their tools. What are those campsites actually like? How are they organized? And who's living there? And what activities are they engaging in? I have up here what we know. For all of you who live in Colorado or local regions, you know that Folsom people, we all know simply as humans, that Folsom people made fire, they used hearths, and they also certainly built themselves residential structures. You can see these pictures on the bottom here. When we think about individuals living at the very end of the Ice Age here in North America, it's impossible to imagine they weren't using fire and they weren't building themselves structures, right? Who wants to just, crawl into a snow cave and live there? But finding evidence of hearths and finding evidence of household structures, essentially houses, are very difficult to identify archaeologically. We know that they lived in houses. We know that they used fire. But finding traces, direct evidence of those behaviors in those structures can be extremely difficult. So part of what I'm going to talk about today is really how at one particular site, Barger Gulch, we were able to interpret the presence of hearths and residential structures to really sort of recreate what life at this camp would have been like. What you see on the bottom there are a variety of hunter-gatherer structure types. Hunter-gatherers all over the world, all modern humans, make structures and live in them. It's much more comfortable to sleep inside of a structure. If you've ever been camping, you know how much you appreciate having a tent with you. So while we know all hunting and gathering peoples make structures, as I mentioned, we do have this difficult time identifying them archaeologically. For those of you who might be familiar with the more recent archaeological record, you know that we frequently find things like post molds Or we've seen a few slides of the Mountaineer Folsom site outside of Gunnison that actually had rock structures. We can see the formation of those walls, and daub has been found there. But at the majority of Folsom sites, we don't see any clear direct evidence of the structures themselves. The reason we care so much about finding households is if you think about your own life, imagine how much archaeologists of the future could learn about you if they had access to your house. Where is your house located? What's inside of your house? How do you organize all of your items of material culture within those household structures? We can think about how neighborhoods are organized. We know that how people set up their household living spaces tells us a lot about the values, about the decisions, about the strategies of those peoples themselves. So it's not that I'm just obsessed with finding Folsom houses. I know if we can find Folsom houses, we can then start talking about how people organize their activities within those structures and around them as well. Here we're looking at a Jowanzi camp. So this is a classic group of hunter-gatherers located in Africa. A number of archaeologists have gone out to this region to work with similar populations. Ed Wilmson may have something to say about this later as well. What you see in that photograph up top is a black and white picture of one of these hunter-gatherer residential camps. What you see down below is how an archaeologist might interpret one of these camps, right? Just based on mapping of different material goods. What I've just highlighted here is in red, you see the hearth features. What I've highlighted in blue, those are these household residential structures. This is a group of highly mobile hunter-gatherers, and we expect such populations to make relatively temporary household structures. Notice all of those little dots in lines. Those are actually mapping pieces of material culture associated with those households. This is ultimately what we want to be able to do archaeologically, right? Instead of items of material culture, we call them artifacts. But we want to find the relationship between those hearths and structures. And you can notice we have sort of clumps of material goods. Just as we would expect, just at all of your households, there's clumps of material goods located where we live and some blank spaces in between. Here we're looking at part of the Barger Gulch site. What you're seeing on your left is what we refer to as the main block. What you see on your right is what we refer to as the east block. Those red blobs, you see 3 of them located there, are where we think the location of hearth features are as we were excavating the site. Now, as we were excavating, we found a little bit of evidence of hearths. In certain excavation units, we'd find higher frequencies of charcoal, little tiny pieces of burnt bone. But we certainly didn't find a hearth feature that you might expect if you were to go out camping today, a nice ring of rocks with a big pile of charcoal within it. It was much more dispersed and ephemeral looking. So let's start with this issue of finding hearths. If we're going to understand residential site organization, let's find the hearths and let's find the structures, and then talk about what material goods are associated with them. So I have hearths at Barger Gulch. We're often barely recognizable in the field. It's kind of good that it's so dark. You cannot see the hearth in that photo. You could barely see it while we were excavating as well. That second bullet point there is what's most important. They were more easily identified in the artifact assemblage than its morphological features in the site matrix. These sites, we'd be excavating and an excavator would call us over and say, I think there's a lot of charcoal here, there might be a hearth. We'd take a bazillion photographs. What would happen is later in the lab, when we're analyzing all of those artifacts, if you start mapping out in space frequencies of burned artifacts, frequencies of charcoal, frequencies of burned bone, they nicely highlight the locations of these hearth features that weren't so obvious in the sediments themselves. So what you're seeing here on the left is all mapped artifacts, so a basic plan map of the site. You see where our locations of the 2 hearths we thought we had found during excavation. What you're seeing on the right is the frequency of burned artifacts. Notice that we get a high density of burned artifacts right over those supposed hearth features. What this suggests is, even though these hearths maybe aren't so obvious while we're excavating, if we start plotting out the density and frequency of burned artifacts within the site, they make these nice little hot spots. In this case, we seem to have 2 hot spots where a lot of burned artifacts are aggregating, and we're calling those hearths. Here you're looking at that same information in a slightly different way. This is a different portion of the site. This is what we call the East Block. Again, all of those little sort of dot images that you're seeing there, we're seeing the frequency and density of burned materials across the site. And they sort of nicely pick up these hearth areas. Having identified a few hearths in the site assemblages, we then sort of turned our attention to finding household structures. Again, if we look at a global sample of mobile hunter-gatherer societies, we know at their residential sites over and over and over again, it's the location of hearths and the location of residential structures that tells us most about the activities of those occupants themselves. When it comes to finding houses archaeologically, again, without post molds, without remnants of the walls themselves, this can be very difficult to identify. A few basic points. These are also very obvious. The one thing we know about houses is they have walls. And they have walls because houses serve as spatial barriers. The reason we live in houses is because we want to keep some things in and some things out. If you think about that basic sort of some things being inside, some things being outside, we should certainly be able to apply that to the archaeological record. If we're excavating a site where structures once stood on its surface, it means the artifacts within those spaces and the artifacts outside of those spaces should be moving around that site and being utilized by the site occupants in very different ways. If they weren't being used in different ways, why would we have walls in the first place, right? So I have, therefore, walls should have archaeological consequences, and houses should be evident in the spatial distribution of material remains in archaeological sites. Okay, so we have this big excavation area. We have over 75,000 artifacts. We're thinking we have some hearths. Let's find some walls within that data. So what are we looking for exactly? I have very simply, and again, you see 2 examples of different kinds of hunter-gatherer dwellings there. Walls should appear as breaks in spatial patterning. If you think about your own house, if all the walls were to magically disappear and all of your stuff was just to come crashing down to the ground surface, it would probably leave a pretty nice footprint of where those walls actually were, right? So what we're looking for in our artifact assemblage at Barger were linear and continuous differences in either the type or the density of artifacts across the excavated surface. When we look at a sample of hunter-gatherer dwellings, when we talk about highly mobile populations, we know that hunter-gatherers tend to use sort of oval or roundish shelters. It's usually not until we see people kind of settling down, being less mobile, that we start to see big built structures, usually of a rectangular floor plan. So we're looking for sort of oval or roundish shapes that may indicate breaks, again, in those artifact distributions. We expect them to be somewhere between 2 to 6 meters in maximum dimension. Again, where did we come up with 2 to 6 meters? That kind of fits your average dome tent size, actually. But also, again, looking at the hunter-gatherer record, highly mobile groups tend to have very small houses that are highly portable. And this 2 to 6 meters in maximum dimension seems to incorporate most of the variability we see. So at the bottom there, I have, ideally, we're looking for breaks in spatial patterns that are repeated across the site. I'm about to show you a lot more figures with little dots on them. This is not how most of us are used to looking at artifacts. When we see artifacts, we want to see those pretty pictures. We want to put them in functional and typological categories, like I just showed you. Here's the scrapers. Here's the gravers, right? These are what the channel flakes look like. In this case, because we're looking for structures that would be evident in the break in spatial patterning among artifacts, we're simply going to treat these Folsom artifacts as objects of different size and shape. Again, imagine if the walls of your house suddenly disappeared, or if you spent some time living in a tent, if you could make that tent itself suddenly disappear. You'd be left with a pile of material goods that nicely map out the footprint of where that structure once was. It doesn't matter what those goods themselves are, whether it's your dirty socks in the tent, whether it's all of the furniture you have in your home. It just matters that there's a difference between the stuff that would have been inside the walls and outside the walls. So for now, we're going to look at a bunch of pictures of Folsom artifacts, and we're just going to be looking at them as objects, dots across a surface, and how they may reflect space. We believe we've detected household structures at the site based on a number of different lines of evidence. First, I have artifact density gradients. I'm going to show you those pictures in a minute. Looking at density in burning indices, so how many of those artifacts across the surface, how dense they are, and which ones are burnt and which ones aren't. We're going to look at average artifact size. We've also done some work looking at occupation surface slope that I'm not going to talk about today. I'm going to give you more than enough maps than you want to see. So as promised, we're going to take all of our beautiful, awesome, Folsom artifacts that we all like to look at and admire, and we're going to reduce them simply to objects on a surface. In this case, you're seeing artifact density gradients. So imagine across an excavated surface, we've mapped all of our artifacts. We can tell based on sort of 50 centimeter squares, the density of materials across space. You're looking at the east block here, and you're seeing this density gradients in two different ways. First, on the left, you notice there's our hearth in the middle. And notice you can see a faint change in artifact densities, sort of in a circular shape around it. To sort of highlight that, what you're seeing on the right is the difference between the density of big artifacts versus small artifacts. And notice we get that nice sort of round, sort of ovular shape. It's roughly the size and shape of what we'd expect to see for a hunter-gatherer dwelling. Part of what we're probably seeing here is this buildup of larger items around the walls of a shelter. Again, for any of you who have spent some time in a tent, you know that pushed up against the walls tends to be where those bulky things go. That's where you want out-of-the-way materials to be pushed. We see this in hunter-gatherer sites around the world today. We expect differences in the size of things to perhaps indicate the location of walls. So here we're looking at possible wall locations based on artifact density gradients. Here we're looking at that exact same area. Instead of artifact density gradients, here we're looking at burning frequencies. So on the left, what you see there is a hearth in the middle. You see that scatter of little black dots. Those are all mapped artifacts. What you're seeing on the right is not only the density of artifacts, but the percentage of those artifacts that are burnt. Big circles mean lots of dense burnt artifacts. So what you see is lots of circles right on top of our hearth. We have sort of an ovular area around it where you don't see a lot of burned materials. Outside of that area, we see burning gradients pick up once again. This is also a common trend we see in hunter-gatherer sites. People need to clean out their hearth. Again, if you've ever been camping or have a fireplace, eventually you need to clean out a lot of that debris, right? Or things aren't burning properly. It's not uncommon for hunter-gatherers to take that burnt material outside of their hearths and dump it outside. I think part of what we're seeing here is a high density of burned materials located on the hearth, and also the dumping of burnt materials, perhaps outside of their household structure. Here again, we're looking at artifact size. What you're seeing on the right is average mass. Again, what's noticeable here is the large artifacts, those cores, those larger pieces of flaking debris, tend to be located outside of what we're calling a living area as opposed to inside. This is probably where you're dumping your trash and getting rid of those big materials. Based on these lines of evidence, and I mentioned we also looked at things like slope. If you are putting up a structure, you probably want it to be in a nice flat area, right? If you've ever slept in a sleeping bag on a slope, you know how incredibly uncomfortable it is. Going through those over 70,000 artifacts, looking at the densities of burning, looking at gradients in artifact size, so nothing to do with tool morphology, simply this distribution of goods on the surface. We've suggested that at the Barger Gulch site itself, what we're seeing is 3 inside hearths and 1 outside hearth. You see the main block, the east block, and the south block there. One of those early images I showed you showed those excavation areas in relation to each other. What we think we see here in the main block, those little sort of blue squiggly lines, that's where all of our different lines of evidence suggest we have major breaks in the spatial patterning of artifacts across this surface. That's what we expected for walls. Do I think these sort of bluish-gray blobs directly outline the shape of household Folsom age structures? Probably not exactly, but I think about this size and this ovular shape, those three all with a hearth in their interiors. The main block, we have another hearth outside of it that doesn't show those repeated spatial patterns around it. We think we're seeing three different household structures, each with an associated hearth inside, and in the case of the main block, an associated outdoor hearth as well. This is kind of exciting. I told you, we know Folsom people made hearths. We know they lived in houses. No one was just crashing in the snow. But to actually see it archaeologically when we don't have post molds, when we don't have big rock structures, is pretty exciting. I showed you this picture before, this Jowanzi camp in Botswana. And what you're again seeing here are structures associated with hearths. A lot of ethnoarchaeological work on hunter-gatherer campsites based on the location of structures in hearths. People have been able to recreate things about the demography of camp life, right? Structures that have bigger families within them tend to be larger. We know that among hunter-gatherers, your immediate neighbors tend to be people you like and that you interact with and maybe trade raw materials and help each other out with. So we know these overall camp layouts can tell us something about demography of the populations themselves. So turning back to our Barger assemblage, we started asking some basic questions about what I'm calling household demography. If we can call those sort of blobs within our excavation area hearths and associated structures, we can then start asking, well, are all of those household structures the same? Or are they different? Can we pick up differences between different households who are camping together at the site? One of the things we've looked at is I have quantity and frequency of tool types. Does every household structure have the same basic complement of tools, or are they different? We've also looked at things like skill level. I think skill level is a fun one. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit here. What we're seeing is our main block and our east block again. In our east block, another hearth, another structure. On average, we have over 1,242 artifacts per square meter. That's a lot of stuff. Again, we're located near a raw material source, and they are clearly making lots of tools, so it's not unexpected we'd have a lot of debitage. But notice on the left, we have an average of 411 artifacts per square meter. These suggest two different things might be happening within these households. What you're seeing here is a comparison of flint knapping skill between our east and our main blocks. You see a picture of one of the bifaces there on your left. And for those of you who have looked at bifaces or other stone tools, you know that occasionally flint knappers make little mistakes. They make errors. They leave step fractures and ugly little bits on their edges. We can actually go through a series of bifaces or any assemblage and start counting up those errors. What we're seeing on the right is sort of a graphic display of quantifying those errors. So you see error density in number per square centimeter. So imagine a biface divided up into square centimeters and coming up with the average number of errors you would expect to see on those bifaces in those areas. According to this scale, low skill flint knappers, so lots of errors, would be up top, and skill would be increasing as we decrease the number of those errors. Notice we have a major difference between the east block and the main block. In our east block, where we had lots and lots of materials, remember the density of artifacts was significantly higher than what we saw in the main block. We're also probably seeing lower skilled flint knappers. We know lower skilled flint knappers make lots more debitage, right? They make more mistakes. Part of what we might be seeing, the difference between this east block and the main block, At least in this case, it looks like we're seeing differences in household demography in the sense of some of our structures are associated with only highly skilled flint knappers, and some of our structures are associated with both high skill and low skilled flint knappers. There's a lot of different interpretations for that. I would like to suggest when we see lots of low skilled flint knapping at some of these Folsom sites, I think in some of our household structures, we're seeing the presence of children who are learning how to flint knap. What age were they? I have no idea, but clearly novice flint knappers who are just getting the handle on it. We see lots of Folsom projectile points and cool finish tools. Folsom people had to learn those behaviors, right? There has to be some of that lousy stuff that's out there. I think part of the difference we're seeing between our main block and our east block are differences in skill level, where we have novices, we have a lot more debris, and we have much higher error rates. So it's telling us a little something about the households at these sites, one of which consists of only highly skilled flint knappers, one appears to consist of a range of flint knapping skill, which suggests a more diverse array of knapping ability individuals lived within those households. Another thing we've been able to do at the site, notice all of those little black blobs, you've been seeing lots of these pictures, those lines connecting them are artifact refits, right? So going through and seeing how those individual pieces of stone refit back together. Again, notice in our east block, you can barely see all of the lines because it's so dense. Most of those refits actually correspond to where we believe those walls were located as well. So it suggests a lot of these knapping activities, at least here in our east block, are occurring within these interior spaces. I want to point out that a lot of this refitting, for anyone out in the audience who've ever tried this, it's insanely tedious and time-consuming. Most of the lines on this map come from John Laughlin, who worked on the site in these refits for his master's thesis at the University of Wyoming. So plug for John Laughlin. Thank you for making all those lines. When it comes to artifact refitting, yes, it makes these really fancy maps where we can connect the dots between individual artifacts, but we can also start looking at how artifacts are moving within these Folsom residential sites. Here what you're seeing is average refit distance. This is in meters. And you're seeing it for flake tools versus debitage. Notice the average refit distance between flake tools. And by flake tools, I mean we have flake tools that have clearly been broken and reworked. We have flake tools we can connect back to bifaces and cores. So by flake tools, we're seeing those tools themselves and either the parent material it came from or the reworking of those tools themselves. Notice flake tools have average refit distances that are greater versus debitage, which doesn't seem to move around the site much. That's exactly what we would expect. If debitage is truly debitage, it's the waste product, it's going to stay in place. Those tools, once manufactured, are going to start moving around the site depending on where your activities are located. We also have some basic data on artifact class. We've since increased our sample here, so this is a pretty small sample of the site. But notice retouch flakes, their mean sort of refit distances are about 98 centimeters. Bifaces, it's even greater, about 152 centimeters. What's been most interesting, I think, at the site are channel flakes. Average refit distance between channel flakes, 266 centimeters. If channel flakes are truly debitage, if they're waste products of point manufacturing, we would expect them to be down in that debitage category, right? And refits between items of debitage tend not to be very great. They're left in place. As Cody just mentioned and a few other people have mentioned, we know that occasionally channel flakes are retouched and used as tools. Not only are channel flakes appear, at least at Barger Gulch, to have been used as tools, we have some retouched ones as well, they tend to be moving around the site in ways that other artifacts simply are not. This kind of reminds me, if you've ever witnessed a flint knapper replicating, say, a Folsom point. I know Bob Patton's out here. If any of you had the experience to do that, you know once those channel flakes are removed, we all ooh and ah. Everybody grabs it, wants to look at it. We pass it around. I'm not saying that's what Folsom people were doing, but they were clearly moving channel flakes around the site in a way they weren't moving other tools. They were clearly recognized as somehow unique or distinct in some way and have very unusual refit patterns. Here we're looking again at our main block. So we have that central hearth where we think a structure was located around it. If we start looking in a more fine-grained way at what those actual tools are, not just looking at artifacts as little blobs on the landscape, but looking more closely at the diversity of tools within the site, we notice that around our hearth, and primarily to the northwest, that's where we tend to see the majority of flake tools, and those are all located in what we would consider an interior space based on our wall locations. So on the northwest side of hearths, at least at this Folsom site, that appears to be where people are utilizing their flake tools. That's where the majority of scrapers and gravers are located in this portion of the site. To the south of that, also located right around where we expect those wall locations to be, we tend to find lots of debitage clusters. And by clusters, I mean aggregates of debitage. And based on refits, we know those are representing multiple napping events. We interpret these debitage clusters to represent cleaning. These are those little piles of debris when you clean up your floor and you maybe push them against the wall. Located near our outside hearth feature, but a little distance away, perhaps storing these items to keep them out of the way. These are things that are big enough you could actually sort of trip over and maybe don't want to be tripping over all the time, is where the majority of those cores are located. We also have some refits going up there between those cores and the flake tools that were then brought inside the house and utilized around the hearth. So we have major sort of debris-making activities, large items like cores, located outside of that interior living space. These sort of general patterns, while not shocking, I have up there Folsom people lived in household structures. Shocker. I think we all could have agreed that they probably built houses and had hearths and organized their space around those built structures and features. They've been hard for us to find them archaeologically. We only have a handful of Folsom sites where we can identify hearth features and even fewer sites where we can identify household structures. So by looking at artifacts in a slightly different way, just looking at them as objects across a surface that are going to respond to the location of walls and fire and heat, I think we've been able to identify some fun patterns at the Barger Gulch site. That picture up top, in the picture I started my presentation with, sort of an artistic representation of maybe what the site itself would have looked like. We probably have not excavated the entire site. I would expect more of these sort of household clusters to be out there. Perhaps circular, perhaps not. We don't know the overlying shape. But I'd like to say artifact variables such as artifact density, size, and burning can provide some really unique glimpses into Folsom organization and kind of forces us to not just look at artifacts as fancy, pretty objects, but as indicators of how people are actually living among the spaces that we were excavating. And that's sort of the end. But I have to say thank you to a bunch of people. Lots of work funded by different organizations. And I have up there many thanks to our field crew. All of those about 70,000 dots you saw on those maps required an excavator to stop and piece plot every single one of them. So I can't thank enough our field crews who helped with that. Thank you. We think so. So I was asked in my sort of reconstructions of where we think the walls were, they often had a little opening. We consistently sort of found that opening, so we could find sort of nice spatial patterns all the way around a hearth feature, and on almost every single one, so we have 3, we believe, there'd be an area that it just, the statistical signal wasn't strong enough. We do think those are probably doorways, right? We're seeing the entrance and exit, and we're seeing artifacts moving in and out of there, and they're not making those nice clear breaks. Are they unidirectional? Yes, they're not all exactly facing the exact same orientation like on a compass, but they do appear to be consistent based on wind patterns in the region. If we can sort of extend those back to Folsom times, you do have your door oriented in the direction you'd want, not to have wind constantly blowing in and messing with your fire. So they do seem to be consistent, and we do think they're door openings.
What do you believe the occupation, the time of occupation there was? Do you have any idea?
We do. We have a whole series of radiocarbon dates. It's nicely within that Folsom time period. So it was probably occupied, I'd say, within generations of Lindenmeier. I mean,
Over and over again at the same site then?
in the case of Barger, I showed you those refit maps. Ideally, we'd have some refits going between those excavation areas, so we could say definitively all of these sort of household structures were occupied contemporaneously, right? We don't have that at this point. We do believe, however, based on the stratigraphic association, based on the similarities between those different structures, we think these were all occupied at the same time. Is it possible I'm wrong? Yes. Is it possible there's more of them out there? Yes. But the raw materials, the frequency of goods within them, although it varies, we think that's a camp structure, multiple households, multiple residents, everybody living together at the same time.
The difference in density between the east and the west sample units be related to reduction strategies, early stage versus late stage? And secondly, whether how you feel about the flint knapping in the household. From my own bloody feet, it seems like it doesn't work very well in a household as a household activity.
First part, definitely yes. Different flint knapping strategies create different amounts of debris, and we would expect there to be a different, say, average number of pieces per square meter, which is what we're looking at. What I didn't mention is we've also compared between those two blocks the percentages of cortex present on flakes, platform characteristics, number of flaking scars per flake, which should pick up those different flint knapping strategies. We don't find those differences. We find them pretty consistent. So you're right. In this case, I feel like we can eliminate that as a possibility. The idea of flint knapping in your house, I mentioned in the main block, the cores and a lot of initial reduction does seem to be taking place outside, no doubt. If you've ever flint knapped, you do not want to be stepping on this. This is not something I would want to be happening in my living room. We know there's ethnographic accounts. Actually, there's some great ones from Papua New Guinea who talk about the fact that flint knapping leaves this debris and little kids in the camp are always hurting their feet on them. So you purposely have to clean out that material. I didn't talk about this. I do suspect that the floors within these structures, if we can call them that, what we've delineated as household structures, I think there was something down there. It was prepared in some way. We think the site was likely occupied in winter. I think you would want something on that sort of floor surface. Most of the artifacts within those household regions are either tools that are clearly being utilized, and really small pieces of debris, and then those flake clusters that are pushed to the side. Those really small pieces of debris, you're right, you wouldn't want to be walking or sitting or sleeping on any of that as well. I'm imagining there's some floor surface, and we're seeing all those little materials trickle down to the bottom. That's the stuff you can't clean up, right? That's all the little stuff like in your carpet that you never really get out. So you're right, it is sort of when we first started doing this and you try to imagine it and you think, wait, there's just debitage all over your floor in your house? Like, not to make a judgment call, but that's kind of dangerous, I would think, you know. So either Folsom people were really sloppy and didn't care, had great shoes. I think more likely there was a floor, and we don't have evidence of that. But I think that's what's going on there. Not a one. Nope. When we deal with the archaeological record of highly mobile populations, it's not uncommon that we don't find burials or remains of the individuals themselves, right? If you think about it, if you were moving every couple of weeks with a group of individuals, what's the likelihood that someone's going to croak at a particular, sorry to put it bluntly, but at a particular site? It's not so good. If you live in the same place, okay, those bodies are going to start building up. So it's not uncommon in hunter-gatherer situations that we don't see cemeteries or lots of graves. In Barger itself, no. We haven't found any human remains, and we actually have very little bone. I mentioned burnt bone in those hearths. We have really burnt up, looks like bison bone in some of these hearth features, but we don't find a lot of other bones. So there could be some preservation issue, or we're just not finding it here. I frequently refer to them as households because in hunter-gatherer camps, a structure is usually a household, right? So, and that could be anything from a nuclear family, that could be related individuals. You often see segregation by age groups, right? You'll have like teenagers who set up their own household. I've been very hesitant to assign numbers of individuals to these groups. I would say each of those households, I would expect multiple individuals to be living within them. So anywhere from 2 to, say, 6 people. We could sort of play the game of how many tools do we have or how much debitage, and can we kind of come up numerically with relating that to those to numbers of people. But then we need to account for how long the occupation was. Was it a week? Was it 2 weeks? I don't have a good handle on that. I would be guessing if I told you a number. Sorry. Work on that. Not much Table Mountain, but we do see Trout Creek. One of the other unique things about these sort of households, if we can call them that, they all are dominated by the locally available lithic raw material. A couple of them, 2 of them both have Trout Creek chert. There's a gray raw material that's shared between the other 2 households, and there's also some unique raw materials we only find within particular households, right? So it's suggesting some of these household individuals may have been on previous mobility events together and had access to similar raw materials, but we also see some unique raw materials that suggest there's some sense of independence, at least in terms of raw material access between the households. That'd be a fun thing that I think deserves more attention. We think so. When we first started working at the site, because it was located so near this lithic raw material source, the first thought was, this is going to be a quarry, right? And at some of these crumbling chert outcrops, there's actually Locality A, I'm talking about Locality B, is a big outcrop of troublesome chert, and it looks like a classic quarry site, right? There's everything from Folsom to, last week, people procuring raw materials and leaving flaking debris, and it has that classic quarry feel. When we first started excavating Barger, one of the things we noticed was the number of tools. We have a series of tools that have not only been utilized, but we know through mostly looking at retouch patterns, but refit patterns have been made on site, were used on site, and then were retouched on site. So that suggests people were there long enough to really be engaging in different activities. So a huge diversity of flake tools. We know points were being made on the site. There's one, let's see if I have it here. Yeah.